Hey there. Tonight we're diving into a period of history so wild, so brutal, and so utterly unbelievable, it makes Game of Thrones look like a polite tea party. We're talking about the Dark Ages, specifically the 6th century in what's now France, where life was cheap, power was everything, and two queens were about to rewrite the rules with poisoned daggers and sheer, terrifying will. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and get ready, because history is about to get very uncomfortable. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Let's dive in. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Francia in the year 567. The good news? You're not a slave, probably. The bad news? You're still living in the crumbling, often disease-ridden leftovers of the mighty Roman Empire, where the grand aqueducts lay shattered, and personal hygiene is, at best, an optional seasonal activity. Your home is likely a drafty wooden hut, scarcely larger than a modern garden shed, with a thatched roof that doesn't just leak when it rains, which is often, but often drips a cold, persistent stream right onto your straw bed. Forget running water indoors. There are no indoor toilets, just buckets that get emptied into the nearest ditch, or perhaps, if you're lucky, an abandoned Roman latrine pit. Central heating is a distant, forgotten dream. You're relying on a smoky fire pit smoldering in the middle of your packed earth floor, sharing its meager warmth with your entire family and whatever livestock you've brought indoors for safekeeping from bandits or wolves. And the smell? Oh, the smell. Let's just say scented candles haven't been invented yet. And even if they had, they couldn't possibly compete with the overwhelming aroma of damp, unwashed wool, unbathed bodies that haven't seen soap in months, and whatever strange concoction is fermenting, or perhaps just rotting, in the corner. Your bed, a straw mattress, isn't just uncomfortable. It's a teeming ecosystem of unwelcome tiny guests, fleas, lice, and worse, that make sleep an itchy, scratchy nightmare. But hey, at least you're not dealing with the relentless, headache-inducing machinations of royalty, right? Speaking of royalty, let's talk about the Franks. These were the Germanic tribes who, over centuries, had moved into the former Roman territory of Gaul, establishing their own rough-and-tumble kingdoms. The Romans, in their declining glory, used to think they were terrifying monsters with wild, unkempt hair and brutal throwing axes. They were a force of nature, untamed and often destructive. But honestly, after a few centuries, something remarkable happened. The Franks decided they quite liked Roman stuff. A lot. They coveted the sturdy Roman buildings, even if they were falling apart. They appreciated the paved roads, even if they were overgrown with weeds. And they definitely craved the prestige and legitimacy that came with claiming a piece of the Roman legacy. They wanted to wear the purple, metaphorically speaking, even if their purple was dyed with berries and their empire was a patchwork of warring lords. At this particular moment in 567, the sprawling Frankish lands were theoretically united, but in reality, they were ruled by four ambitious, often antagonistic brothers. They were the sons of a guy named Clothar, who had, for a fleeting moment, managed to reunite the fragmented kingdom of his father, Clovis, before promptly dropping dead and dividing it up again like a messy, squabbling inheritance. These brothers were not exactly the Brady Bunch. They were constantly squabbling, scheming, and trying to grab each other's territory. First, there was Charibert, the oldest, who ruled from Paris. Charibert was infamous for his truly wild and debauched love life, a life so scandalous it shocked even the notoriously less-than-shockable Franks. Then there was Guntram, the crafty middle child, ruling from the wine-rich lands of Burgundy. He was a survivor, always calculating, always playing the long game. And finally, the two youngest, Sigebert in Austrasia, the eastern part of the kingdom, and Chilperic in Neustria, the western part. These two pretty much hated each other's guts and were in a perpetual state of simmering war, a conflict that would define much of the coming decades. Now, Sigebert, our guy in Austrasia, decided it was time to level up his status. His brothers were content marrying local women, sometimes even their own servants. Gasp! But Sigebert, a man with a vision of a greater Frankish kingdom, craved more. He wanted prestige. He wanted undeniable power. He wanted a bride who screamed, through every jewel and silk gown, "I am important." So, he looked south, far beyond the gritty Frankish borders, to Spain, where the sophisticated Visigoths ruled their sun-drenched, Roman-influenced kingdom. Their king, Atanagild, had two daughters, famous not just for their beauty, but for their impeccable royal bloodline. Sigebert, a man who thought big, set his sights on the younger one, the dazzling Princess Brunhild. Imagine this: a princess from sunny, Roman-influenced Spain, where cities still boasted grand baths, paved streets, and a lingering sense of classical culture, was about to marry into the rough-and-tumble, earthy world of the Franks. Brunhild was around 18, reportedly beautiful, sharp-witted, and educated, a rare commodity in Francia. She'd grown up watching her mother, Queen Goiswintha, wield real political influence in the Visigothic court, and she was clearly ready to be more than just a pretty face on a throne. She carried herself with an air of command, a quiet steeliness that belied her youth. Sigebert's court in Metz, keen to impress its new queen, was trying its absolute best to look fancy for the occasion. His palace was a repurposed Roman building, probably still a bit dusty around the edges, with frescoes peeling from the walls and a faint, persistent scent of wood smoke clinging to everything. They rolled out what they hoped would pass as red carpets, or at least the thickest, most brightly dyed rugs they had. Tapestries, perhaps salvaged from a Roman villa or woven locally with crude designs, were hung to hide the crumbling, uneven walls. They even went so far as to hire a renowned poet named Venantius Fortunatus to write a flattering poem for the wedding, a true sign of their ambition to appear more Roman than they actually were. Fortunatus was a bit of a newcomer himself, a classically educated Italian trying to make a name for himself in the Frankish world, which, bizarrely, seemed to be obsessed with all things Roman, despite their own Germanic heritage. He probably sweat through his tunic, even in the chill of Metz, as he stood there, trying to remember his carefully crafted lines about Cupid and Venus, delivering them to an audience that probably still gave offerings to Thor and Odin, and whose idea of poetry involved epic sagas of battle and feasting. But hey, a gig was a gig, and a good performance could make his career in this strange new land. Brunhild arrived not alone, but with a magnificent wagon train overflowing with treasure-gleaming gold, shimmering silver, glittering jewels, and fine clothes from the sophisticated markets of Spain. She was escorted by Sigebert's right-hand man, a young, ambitious count named Go. As she walked into the hall, every Frankish noble and warrior stared. Was she just another piece of exotic treasure to be admired and possessed? Or was she something more? A woman with her own will and ambition? Later, they'd learn the answer was most definitely something more. Sigebert, at 32, was reportedly handsome and a skilled warrior, a man whose presence commanded respect on the battlefield. He was genuinely pleased with his bride, impressed by her intelligence and bearing. This wasn't just a love match, though. This was a calculated power play. By marrying a foreign princess with serious diplomatic connections and royal lineage, Sigebert was sending a clear, unequivocal message to his brothers. He was the one aiming for true greatness, for a kingdom that might one day echo the lost glory of Rome itself. He was building an empire, not just a petty kingdom. This bold move did not go over well, especially with Chilperic, the youngest brother. Chilperic constantly felt overlooked, shortchanged, and overshadowed by his older siblings. While Sigebert was making a splash with an illustrious foreign princess, Chilperic was deeply, even scandalously, involved with a slave girl at his court. This wasn't entirely uncommon. Frankish kings often had multiple relationships, sometimes even marrying servants, as it was a pragmatic way to produce heirs without getting tangled up in the complicated alliances and rivalries of powerful noble families. But Chilperic, famously volatile and impulsive, was not merely involved. He was utterly besotted with this girl, Fredegund. Fredegund, a woman of extraordinary ambition and cunning, had climbed her way up from the grueling anonymity of a kitchen slave to become a trusted, indispensable servant of Chilperic's perfectly respectable first wife, Queen Audovera. Now she was the king's favorite, perhaps even his unofficial wife, holding an intoxicating amount of power for someone of her birth. It took serious smarts, a ruthless streak, and an almost supernatural ability to read people to pull that off in this brutal, stratified world. She was born during a truly awful time. The mid-6th century had been hit by a series of devastating volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun, bringing widespread famine and crop failure. This was followed by the infamous bubonic plague, which swept through Europe like a scythe, wiping out vast swaths of the population. It was a time of death and upheaval, of social collapse and profound fear, but also, for those cunning enough to seize it, a time of unprecedented opportunity. Fredegund was, without a doubt, one of the cunning ones. Chilperic was so utterly smitten with Fredegund that he had already, without much ceremony or regard, sent his perfectly respectable first wife, Audovera, off to a convent, a polite form of banishment. Now, hearing about Sigebert's prestigious, high-profile marriage, Chilperic was furious. He saw it not just as a challenge to his own status, but as a direct, personal affront. But Fredegund, watching from the sidelines with a cool, calculating gaze, was probably just observing and strategizing. She saw how the king reacted to everything, how his moods shifted, how his passions could be stoked and manipulated. She knew that her position, despite the king's infatuation, was precarious. She was, after all, a slave, legally worth less than a cow in the eyes of the law. But she had survived worse, and she was fiercely ambitious. For now she watched, she waited, and she planned. Meanwhile in Paris, the eldest brother, Chalibert, was having problems of his own. Problems that were entirely of his own making. His latest wife was a teenage shepherdess named Theudechilde, and while she had just given him a longed-for son, the baby died almost immediately, plunging him into despair. Charibert, getting on in years and still without a living, legitimate heir to secure his legacy, promptly married again. And this time, in an act of staggering defiance, he married a nun. Now, marrying a nun was a huge no-no in the eyes of the nascent Christian church, and the Frankish church, though still pretty young, fragile, and finding its footing, was trying desperately to lay down the law. They were already struggling with priests who stubbornly refused to stop sleeping with their wives, and a populace that still liked worshipping ancient trees and pagan gods. Charibert's scandalous marriage was a direct challenge to their authority, a public thumbing of the nose at sacred vows. Things got even worse for Charibert. An epidemic, likely the ever-present dysentery or plague, hit Paris, and the bishops were quick to seize the opportunity, blaming the king's sinful, sacrilegious behavior for divine wrath. 9 of his most powerful bishops planned a confrontational meeting, a desperate intervention to force him to repent. Charibert, either blissfully clueless or arrogantly defiant, allowed them to proceed. It did not go well. They begged him, implored him, to leave the nun. He flatly refused, dismissing their pleas. And for that, in a move that sent shockwaves through the Frankish world, he became the first Frankish king to be excommunicated. Talk about bad press. This was a direct blow to his legitimacy and standing. Stunned, shamed, and now a pariah in the eyes of the church, Charibert retreated to a quiet villa outside Bordeaux. He went hunting, perhaps to clear his head, perhaps to escape his problems. And conveniently, or tragically, he dropped dead, likely of a heart attack, though some whispered of other causes. What do you do with an excommunicated king's body? You certainly can't bury him in sacred ground, not alongside his famous grandfather Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. So they carted him off to an old, abandoned Roman fort and buried him, ignominiously, like a pagan. Not exactly the send-off a king who saw himself as the heir to Roman glory would have wanted. Back in Metz, Brunhild and Sigebert weren't shedding too many tears for Charibert. They were far too busy calculating how his sudden, scandalous death affected them. 4 kingdoms were now 3. Who would get the best pieces of the pie? And what about Charibert's considerable wealth, his vast treasury, and his loyal followers? Enter Theodechilde, the shepherdess queen, cast aside for a nun, now seeing her chance for redemption and power. The nun was dead. Charibert's scandalous marriage invalidated in the church's eyes. Theodechilde, as the briefly acknowledged mother of the king's son, could now claim to be the rightful widow. And as a royal widow, she had access to the treasury, a potent tool. Frankish queens couldn't command armies in the field, but they could hand out lavish gifts, coins to a bishop, jewels to a noble, land to a loyal warrior, to build vital alliances. Theodechilde had bigger plans than mere survival. She dreamt of regaining her lost status. She loaded up all of Charibert's gold and jewels onto carts, a massive fortune that must have required the help of some heavily bribed guards and servants. She stashed the treasure securely, and then, channeling her inner Roman empress, a figure she probably only knew from whispered legends, she proposed marriage to the next eldest brother, Guntram. Guntram, ever the crafty and opportunistic one, saw an opportunity too. He told her to come, bring her treasure, and he'd give her an honorable place in his court. Theodechilde, hopeful and perhaps a little naive, rode south with the goods. Guntram welcomed her, took the treasure, then, in a moment of cruel and calculated treachery, laughed in her face, called her unworthy, and just like Chilperic had done to Audovera, packed her off to a nunnery in Arles. He then, with breathtaking cynicism, married one of his own ex-wife's former slaves. So much for honor. For Brunhild, watching this brutal drama unfold from Metz, there was a harsh, undeniable lesson. Playing politics, especially for queens, was dangerous. Men, particularly Frankish kings, hoarded power with a fierce grip and would crush a woman's ambition without a second thought. And Theodechilde's story ended even worse. She tried to escape the convent with a Visigothic suitor, was caught and beaten mercilessly, left to suffer until she died, a tragic victim of ambition and royal cruelty. It was a grim preview of the treacherous, unforgiving world Brunhild was navigating. But unlike Theodechilde, Brunhild had powerful family connections, an unshakable ambition, and a keenly intelligent mind. And she was about to prove that she wouldn't be so easily cast aside. In the months after her wedding, Brunhild was settling into life in Metz. It wasn't Toledo, with its lingering Roman elegance and vibrant intellectual life, But Metz was prosperous, surrounded by pleasant, rolling countryside. The view from her palace window, though, was a stark reminder of her new reality. An old Roman amphitheater, where instead of sophisticated gladiatorial contests, they now had crude, brutal bear baiting. Charming. She found the Frankish court a bit rustic, certainly less refined than her Visigothic upbringing. They preferred loud, boisterous national epics and heroic sagas to the sophisticated poetry and philosophical discussions she was accustomed to. She had admirers, certainly, but few true intellectual companions. Her Latin was excellent, but most Frankish nobles spoke a deformed version of it, or the emerging Frankish language, a guttural tongue she was still mastering. She missed her mother and sister, the familiar faces and cultural nuances of home. The poet Fortunatus, still hanging around after the wedding, hoping for more work and patronage, was a welcome distraction. He matched her education, at least in part, and entertained her with tales of his travels and classical allusions. But soon, Fortunatus was off again, ever the opportunist. This time he headed to Paris, hired by the recently excommunicated Charibert. Charibert, nearing 50 and still heirless, was desperately trying to salvage his shattered image with a grand ceremony and, of course, a flattering poem. Fortunatus delivered with characteristic panache, praising Charibert as a most excellent king and boldly comparing him to the conquering Roman emperor Trajan. He even shrewdly sucked up to the clergy, calling Charibert pious and mature, a masterclass in flattery, especially since the king's scandal was still so fresh and raw. But the bishops weren't fooled. The church was fighting fiercely for its place in this chaotic world, trying to enforce crucial rules against incest and married priests, establishing its authority. Charibert's public defiance was an unacceptable challenge. So, when the epidemic hit Paris, the bishops saw it as undeniable divine judgment. They finally, decisively, excommunicated him, stripping him of his spiritual standing. Charibert's death, shortly thereafter, left his kingdom open for the taking. His brothers, Sigibert, Guntram, and Chilperic, immediately started squabbling over it, like vultures over carrion. Gundovald, Sigibert's illegitimate half-brother, who had been living at Charibert's court and was rumored to be his chosen heir, was quickly hustled away and had his long, royal hair cut short. This was the Frankish way of saying unequivocally, "You're out of the running for the throne." He was effectively neutralized as a political threat. Brunhild, meanwhile, got pregnant. Great news indeed. A male heir would solidify her position, giving her undeniable leverage and security in this treacherous court. She probably felt a pang of sympathy for Gundovald, another outsider like her, now cruelly sidelined. But the baby, when it arrived, was a girl. Another potential heir for the Frankish world, certainly, but not the son Brunhild needed to feel truly secure and powerful. Still, the division of Charibert's lands went ahead in early 568. Paris, the old capital, a city of symbolic importance, was declared neutral territory to be shared by all three brothers. The rest of the kingdom was carved up, a messy inheritance for the remaining siblings. Chilperic, always feeling cheated and underestimated, got the smallest share, a patchwork kingdom in the north and southwest, strategically vulnerable. This left him furious, especially since Sigibert, his hated rival, got strategically important cities like Tours and Poitiers right in the middle of Chilperic's new, fragmented lands. Chilperic, ever the hothead, immediately invaded Tours and Poitiers, brazenly breaking the fragile peace that had just been brokered. His army was led by his eldest son, Theudebert, the very boy Sigibert had spared years earlier after another of Chilperic's failed invasions. This forced Theudebert to break his solemn oath of loyalty to his uncle, a major no-no in this honor-bound warrior society. But Chilperic's attack failed again. He was boxed in, surrounded by his brothers to the north and east, and in the south by Brunhild's people, the powerful Visigoths, who would not tolerate incursions. Chilperic needed a new strategy. He needed a prestigious alliance, a power move to match Sigebert's. And who better than Brunhild's own sister, Galswintha? King Athanagild of Spain, a proud and shrewd ruler, wouldn't have considered Chilperic before, viewing him as an unstable, less prestigious option. But now, Chilperic had land bordering Spain, and he was desperate. He made an offer no one could refuse. He would give Galswintha a massive mourning gift, not just a few jewels or a villa, but the entire southern third of his kingdom, 5 wealthy cities in Aquitaine. This was an unheard-of dowry, a reckless gamble. Chilperic was risking everything, but he desperately wanted this alliance, and he wanted to outdo Sigebert in grandiosity. Athanagild agreed, but with a crucial condition. Galswintha would convert to Catholicism. The Visigoths were Arian Christians, and this conversion would solidify ties with Orthodox Francia. But Chilperic also had to swear a solemn oath to abandon all other women. Everyone knew this meant Fredegund, his beloved slave girl. Chilperic, eager for the alliance and its perceived prestige, agreed. Fredegund, the slave girl, was to be sent away. But Fredegund, a woman of steel and cunning, wasn't about to disappear quietly into the shadows. She kept her own counsel, her gaze unwavering, and she waited. While Chilperic was scrambling for a new, prestigious bride, Sigebert was basking in the glow of his successful marriage and the recent birth of his daughter, Ingund. He was carefully cultivating an image, building churches, repairing infrastructure in Metz, trying to project himself as a wise, Roman-style ruler, a restorer of order. He was also diligently securing his borders, making strategic alliances. He'd already dealt with the fearsome Avars in the east and the Saxons in the north. Now he looked south to Italy, controlled by the Lombards, and beyond them, the powerful Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, ruling from the magnificent city of Constantinople, still saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome and were actively trying to reclaim Italy from the Germanic tribes. Sigebert wanted to befriend the new Byzantine emperor, Justin II, who was reportedly kind of erratic, a man prone to fits of madness, and whose formidable wife, Sophia, was widely known to be the real power behind the throne. To approach the Byzantines subtly, Sigebert turned to an unlikely yet incredibly influential figure, his own father's 4th wife, Radegund. Radegund was a Thuringian princess, captured as a child, forced into a political marriage with the brutal king Clothar. But she had found her escape, her solace, and ultimately her power in fierce piety. She refused to sleep with the king, starved herself, wore agonizing hair shirts, and even branded herself as a protest against the worldliness of the court. Finally, after Clothar brutally murdered her baby brother, she left him entirely, seeking refuge and spiritual autonomy by becoming a nun. Radegund was no ordinary nun. She established one of the first convents for women in Francia, Holy Cross Abbey in Poitiers, a beacon of learning and spirituality. From there, she became a major political and religious figure, welcoming dignitaries, corresponding with foreign rulers, and even engaging in diplomacy with the powerful Byzantines. So, Sigebert and Brunhild, with their shared vision of a Roman-influenced Francia, sent emissaries to Radegund, including, predictably, the ever-present poet Fortunatus. Their plan: use Radegund's immense religious connections and moral authority to open a discreet channel to Byzantium. Radegund, in turn, wanted a piece of the true cross, a highly prized relic believed to be in Constantinople. She sent her own messengers, carrying a powerful, evocative poem, seemingly a personal account of the Frankish invasion that had destroyed her homeland, but also a subtle warning, a diplomatic message veiled in verse to the Byzantines. The Franks are brutal, yes, but they listen to me. It was a brilliant diplomatic move, understated yet powerful. The response came directly from Empress Sophia herself. She sent the precious relic, solidifying a crucial connection with Radegund, and through her, with Brunhild. Soon after, Sigebert sent his own formal embassy, formalizing an alliance with Byzantium. This alliance also created a profound bond between Brunhild and Radegund. Brunhild, still lonely and often isolated at the rustic Frankish court, found a sympathetic friend and a powerful mentor in the influential abbess Radegund. Radegund even welcomed Brunhild's sister, Galswintha, when she arrived in Frankish lands for her wedding to Chilperic in July 568. Fortunatus noted their close exchanges, with Radegund offering Galswintha much-needed motherly love and guidance. Galswintha's arrival in Rouen was a spectacle designed to outshine Brunhild's. Chilperic, trying desperately to match Sigebert's prestige, met her with his entire army, kneeling in a show of feigned humility. The wedding was held not in a repurposed Roman building, but in the grand cathedral itself, a symbol of royal and ecclesiastical power. Galswintha came with even more treasure than Brunhild had, a dazzling display of wealth. But less than 6 months later, tragedy struck, swift and brutal. Galswintha caught Chilperic in bed with Fredegund, brazenly defying his solemn oath. She was furious, humiliated, her royal pride deeply wounded. She demanded to return home, even if it meant leaving behind her enormous dowry, a staggering fortune in land and treasure. Then, one morning, Galswintha was found dead in her bed, strangled, a pillow pressed over her face. 3 days later, dressed in Galswintha's glittering jewels, Fredegund married Chilperic in a quick, hushed ceremony at a royal villa. The Frankish world was shocked, though perhaps not entirely surprised. Gregory of Tours, the frank and often biased bishop who would chronicle this tumultuous era, stated plainly what everyone suspected. Chilperic had ordered Galswintha's murder. Later art would even portray Chilperic himself doing the deed, sometimes with Fredegund watching, a chilling image of ruthless ambition. Fredegund's origins were murky. She was a slave, and the historical record is conspicuously silent on her family, her lineage. This fueled widespread rumors and deep suspicion. How did a slave gain such terrifying power? Some whispered of witchcraft, of dark pacts and forbidden arts. A later story, perhaps a smear campaign, claimed she'd tricked Chilperic's first wife, Audovera, using obscure church law to depose her. That tale wasn't true at the time, but it clearly shows Fredegund had a formidable reputation for being clever, resourceful, perhaps even literate, highly unusual for a slave. She hadn't thrown a fit when Galswintha arrived. She'd waited, calculating, watching, biding her time. Now she was queen, but her position was shaky. Chilperic had other heirs, sons from his first marriage. Fredegund knew she had to produce children, hopefully sons, to secure her future and cement her power. Lying in the very bed where Galswintha had died, Fredegund must have felt the immense, terrifying weight of it all. Fortunatus, hearing the news, wrote mournfully about the 2 towers from Toledo, one broken, referring to Brunhild's lost sister. Brunhild herself was devastated. In less than 2 years, she'd lost her beloved homeland, her father, and now her only sister, likely murdered by her own husband. She was alone in a foreign land, grappling with a language barrier, surrounded by unfamiliar customs and treacherous politics. Frankish law, the lex salica, surprisingly, had high values for women, especially those of childbearing age. A free woman was worth as much as an aristocrat, even more if pregnant. A queen's worth was incalculable. But who had the power to enforce justice for Galswintha? Brunhild knew she couldn't just grieve. She needed political power, and she desperately needed allies. The nobles at Sigebert's court were, predictably, divided into various factions. One wanted closer ties with Byzantium, another favored a cautious peace with Chilperic, and a third sought alliance with Guntram. Brunhild, understandably, leaned heavily towards the anti-Chilperic group, led by her old escort, Go, a young, ambitious count who had steadily risen through the ranks. Go saw an immense opportunity in Galswintha's brutal death. This was a perfect, morally justifiable excuse for a war with Neustria, not just to avenge their queen's sister, but to seize valuable land and consolidate power. Galswintha's massive mourning gift, the 5 wealthy cities in Aquitaine, became the immediate casus belli. Go, along with Roman-leaning allies like the poet and governor Dynamius, who also served as a chronicler, and the formidable warrior Duke Lupus, Wolf, started meticulously building their case for war. Their main opposition was Bishop Aegidius of Rheims, a powerful conservative figure who favored peace with Neustria, partly because his own family had long-standing land disputes with Lupus in the Champagne region. Aegidius and his allies also included traditionalist Franks, who disliked Roman influence, and perhaps more pointedly, foreign queens like Brunhild. Then there was Duke Gundovald Boso. This guy was a legendary warrior, fearless and utterly unpredictable, driven primarily by self-interest and a thirst for plunder. He often led the pro-Byzantine faction, but in truth, he was pro-Boso, easily swayed by the promise of wealth and glory. Go's faction knew they absolutely needed Boso on their side. A war with Neustria offered plenty of action and plunder, and Boso, despite his volatile nature, eventually agreed not to oppose them, a crucial concession. The plan: a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign. Fortunatus, ever the master of courtly verse, was commissioned to write a powerful elegy for Galswintha. It wasn't just a poem of mourning, it was a political weapon. It painted Galswintha as a saintly victim, a martyr to Chilperic's depravity, and highlighted the outrage in Spain, subtly reminding the Franks that Chilperic's actions could easily lead to a devastating Visigothic invasion. Then, in 570, the timing was absolutely perfect. Brunhild gave birth to a son on Easter morning, a truly good omen in a Christian kingdom. He was named Childebert, after Sigebert's famous uncle, symbolizing continuity and strength. This secured the succession in Austrasia and, crucially, strengthened the alliance with Guntram, who was now convinced that any lands recovered from Chilperic would stay firmly in Frankish hands through Brunhild's son. King Guntram, as the eldest surviving brother, presided over a court convened to try Chilperic for Galswintha's murder. Chilperic, not surprisingly, didn't show up and was convicted in absentia. The verdict gave Sigebert and Guntram the pretext they desperately needed to invade Neustria, starting with Galswintha's mourning gift lands, but aiming clearly to take Chilperic's entire kingdom. The war was on. Sigebert and Guntram's armies, now united, rolled through Neustrian territory with devastating efficiency. The cities of Galswintha's dowry surrendered quickly, often without a fight. Things were going so well that Guntram, in a moment of typical indecisiveness and paranoia, almost backed out, worried that a too powerful Sigebert would come after his kingdom next. But Sigebert, showing his daring, ruthless side, recruited pagan Germanic troops from his vassal kingdoms, essentially creating a mercenary army, a force beholden only to him. Faced with this unruly, formidable force on his border, Guntram reluctantly rejoined the fight. Chilperic was losing, badly. He fled his capital, Soissons, with Fredegund and their children. Fredegund had given birth to a daughter, Rigunth, and in 570, a son, Clodobert. Her position was somewhat more secure as the mother of an heir, but still precarious, as Chilperic's other sons were still alive. As the war intensified, Fredegund's sons' prospects improved in the most brutal way possible. Chilperic's eldest son, Theudebert, leading a doomed defense, was killed by Duke Gundevald Boso. Now, only 2 of Chilperic's sons from his first marriage remained, and they too were in the thick of the fighting, facing mortal danger. Fredegund was pregnant again, desperately hoping for another son, an heir and a spare. Sigebert and his army, joined by the formidable Duke Boso, were pushing relentlessly north. Messengers were sent to bring Brunhild and the children to Paris for a triumphant entry, a symbolic declaration of victory. Bishop Germanus of Paris, fearing the city would be destroyed in the impending conflict, wrote directly to Brunhild, calling her most excellent queen, and begging her to spare Paris. This was a clear sign of her rapidly growing influence and political weight. Brunhild had also used her influence to get her ally, the historian Gregory, appointed Bishop of Tours, an important and wealthy city. Gregory, despite his aristocratic snobbery, owed Brunhild a significant favor. Tours now fell under Chilperic's control, but everyone expected that to be temporary. Chilperic and his family were holed up in Tournai, under siege. Fredegund was in labor, the stress of the siege adding to her ordeal. She gave birth to another boy, but was overcome by a paralyzing fear of death, initially refusing to hold or baptize him, a desperate attempt to deny him to fate. Chilperic, shaken from his stupor of defeat, intervened, forcing the baptism. The baby was given the strange, un-Frankish name, Samson. News reached Sigebert that the nobles in Chilperic's northern territories, sensing the tide turning, were ready to defect en masse and declare him king of all Neustria. Sigebert rode out to accept their offer, leaving Paris to join the siege of Tournai and finish off his brother once and for all. But Fredegund, even in her weakened post-labor state, wasn't done. She called for 2 slave boys, desperate, expendable figures, and in a bold and unprecedented move, gave them poison daggers, sending them to assassinate Sigebert during his inauguration celebration at Vitry-en-Artois. It was a suicide mission, but she promised their families unimaginable rewards for their sacrifice. The boys succeeded. They stabbed Sigebert, and within minutes, the magnificent, victorious king lay dead. Chilperic rushed to Vitry-en-Artois, saw his brother's body, and ordered a proper burial, a cynical gesture of piety. The siege was over. They could return to their palace. Sigebert's assassination broke the unwritten rules of warfare. It was seen as cowardly, underhanded, a heinous act of treachery. And the rumors of Fredegund's involvement, of her using poison, a word inextricably linked to witchcraft in the Frankish mind, solidified her reputation as a ruthless, perhaps even magical figure. Gregory of Tours, ever biased against her, gleefully called her actions maleficent witchcraft. The Franks believed in witches, even if they couldn't quite agree on dragons, and accusing someone of witchcraft was serious, far worse than calling a woman a slut or a harlot. It was an attack on her very being, a condemnation of her soul. But Fredegund didn't seem to care. She preferred to be feared. As she returned to Soissons with Chilperic, she likely met the fearful gazes of the crowds with a cold, triumphant smile. In the chaos after Sigebert's death, many who had defected to him rushed back to pledge loyalty to Chilperic, eager to save their skins. Some even joined Chilperic in executing Sigebert's loyal attendants. The remaining Austrasians, stunned and demoralized, retreated to Metz to regroup, leaving Brunhild and her children in Paris, vulnerable. Brunhild, now a widow for the second time, was trapped. She had her considerable personal treasure, but not the royal treasury, which was essential to buying loyalty and raising an army. Her best chance was to keep her young son Childebert alive. 5-year-old boys were vulnerable, and Chilperic was marching rapidly towards Paris. Childebert had to be smuggled out immediately. Accounts differ. Hidden in a basket, a cart, passed through a window, in a sack to a boat on the Seine. The details are murky, but the desperation was clear. Her daughters were also sent away, reaching safety just over the Austrasian border. Chilperic arrived in Paris expecting to find Brunhilde and her children, but found her alone. He seized her and her treasure, then sent men to find the children. They caught the daughters in Meaux, but missed Childebert, who had slipped through their fingers. Chilperic, perhaps feeling magnanimous after surviving and regaining his kingdom, ordered Brunhilde kept alive, but sent her to a convent in Rouen under the care of Bishop Praetextatus. Her daughters were to remain hostages, ensuring her compliance. Back in Metz, the Austrasian court was somber, but they rallied. A 5-year-old boy was crowned king, a desperate act by warriors who fully expected an attack from Chilperic. Go, Brunhilde's loyal ally, became the boy's regent, his Nertator, the one who feeds and raises the king. Brunhilde found herself in the convent in Rouen, a desolate place reserved for widowed queens or those banished from court. Life there was austere, rough robes, endless prayers at all hours, manual labor. She hated it, a cage for her fierce spirit. Her only way out, her only path to regaining power, was to marry again. Just as her mother, Goiswintha, had done, marrying her dead husband's successor to maintain influence. Meanwhile, Sigebert's half-brother Gundevald, the one who'd had his hair cut, had escaped Byzantine custody and was now living in Constantinople. The Byzantines, ever pragmatic, saw him as a potential puppet king if the Merovingian brothers kept killing each other off. With Sigebert dead and a child on the throne in Austrasia, Gundevald seemed like a good option for a new husband for Brunhilde. He was a carbon copy of Sigebert, a Merovingian prince, and he had a reported rapport with Brunhilde. But getting a bride out of a Neustrian convent was tricky, especially with Empress Sophia in Byzantium dealing with her husband Justin II's growing madness, who was reportedly barking and biting his chamberlains. A more immediate and frankly audacious possibility for Brunhilde's escape emerged closer to home. Chilperic's first wife, Autovera, was also living in Rouen, possibly even at the same convent as Brunhilde. They had a lot in common: ousted queens, targeted by Fredegund. Autovera's sons, Chilperic's remaining legitimate heirs, were now gravely threatened by Fredegund's living boy, Clodebert. Walking the tranquil convent gardens, a daring plan took shape. A marriage between Brunhilde and Autovera's eldest surviving son, Merovec, who was leading Chilperic's army. This wasn't romance, it was rebellion. Merovec would depose his hated father, rule Neustria, and Brunhilde would be queen again, her body the literal link between the two kingdoms, unifying them against Fredegund. They would need help from the sympathetic nuns, using the convent's back channels to communicate and plan. Merovec, sent by Chilperic to conquer territory, instead rode to Tours, where Brunhilde's ally, Bishop Gregory, and the ever-elusive Duke Boso, hiding from Chilperic, were taking refuge. It's unclear who the messenger was. Gregory, the well-connected nun Ingetrude living in the basilica courtyard, or even Boso himself, still looking for a way to gain favor and plunder. Regardless, Merovec got the message. Instead of going south as ordered, he audaciously marched his army north to Rouen to visit his mother, and, secretly, to marry Brunhilde. Brunhilde's second wedding was a stark contrast to her first. Dressed in her finest, no longer in a nun's austere habit, she married Merovec in the cathedral in Rouen. The bishop, Praetextatus, Merovec's godfather, officiated, openly defying Chilperic and pointedly ignoring the church's incest prohibitions. Marrying an uncle's wife was considered incestuous. The cathedral was empty, a quiet rebellion taking place within its hallowed walls. Outside, Merovec's army waited, a silent, menacing presence. Messages slipped through clandestine networks of abbesses, priests, and farmers had orchestrated a coup. They had soldiers. Brunhild had the money, her personal treasure, now under Pretextatus's discreet care, used to bribe disaffected nobles, and they had the element of surprise. Their audacious plan: assassinate Chilperic. If that failed, they would attack his capital, Soissons, from two sides. Merovec from the west, Duke Lupus from the east, with a man on the inside to open the gates. It was a solid plan, bold and well-conceived. But Chilperic, getting wind of the scandalous marriage and the potential plot, marched on Rouen sooner than expected. Merovec and Brunhild were trapped. They hunkered down inside the city walls, hoping for reinforcements. If the walls fell, they would seek sanctuary in a small chapel dedicated to Saint Martin, the patron saint of the Franks, built high on the city walls. They also decided to portray the marriage as a desperate, love-struck elopement, hoping Chilperic would be more lenient with a son blinded by passion than with a calculating political rival. Chilperic arrived, and a tense standoff ensued. Eventually, a truce was called. Chilperic swore not to separate them, if it was God's will. He met with them, shared a meal, seemingly accepting their story. But then, devastating news arrived. Lupus's army was attacking Soissons. The attack failed, but it revealed the true, terrifying scope of the rebellion. Chilperic realized his son, his new wife, and many of his powerful nobles were involved in a vast conspiracy. He began a ruthless purge of his court. Merovec was stripped of his rank and placed under guard. Chilperic gave Merovec's military command to his younger half-brother, Clovis. Chilperic also moved swiftly to delegitimize Merovec's marriage. He added a specific, retroactive law to the Lex Salica, explicitly banning marriage to a dead uncle's wife, thereby making Brunhild and Merovec's union illegal. Then, in the autumn of 576, he had Merovec tonsured, shaving his head like a monk, a symbolic, devastating removal from the royal line. Merovec was ordained a priest, meaning any children he might have with Brunhild would be sacrilege. He was to be sent to a monastery, essentially a state prison. Chilperic then gave Brunhild a stark choice: abandon Merovec and return to Austrasia with her daughters, or stay and lose everything. Brunhild, ever pragmatic, chose her children. Chilperic, eager to be rid of her and avoid further scandal, even let her keep her treasure, which she conveniently left with Bishop Pretextatus, a shrewd investment in funding future rebellions. Brunhild returned to Metz, reunited with her children. Her son, Childebert, traumatized by the separation and the violence, clung to her, never wanting to be separated again. Her allies, Go and Lupus, were still at court, their faction now in the ascendancy. Brunhild was back, and though she had lost a husband and a kingdom, she had saved her children and learned invaluable, brutal lessons in survival and political maneuvering. Merovec never made it to the monastery. A deacon from Tours, sent by Bishop Gregory, Brunhild's staunch ally, and Duke Boso, hiding from Chilperic, urged Merovec to seek sanctuary in St. Martin's Basilica in Tours. Merovec escaped with the help of his loyal friend Galen and arrived in Tours during Mass, dramatically demanding sanctuary. Chilperic, seeing treachery everywhere, relied more and more on Fredegund, who emerged as an increasingly powerful political advisor, her influence palpable. Fredegund, rightly suspicious of Gregory's involvement in Merovec's escape, publicly accused Gregory's envoys of being spies and had them exiled. A tense standoff developed in Tours. With Merovec and Boso holed up in the basilica, and Chilperic's count, Ludast Gregory's personal enemy, trying desperately to smoke them out. Ludast, a former slave who had risen to power through sheer ruthlessness, clearly irritated the snobbish Gregory. Skirmishes broke out between Merovec's supporters and Ludast's men. Chilperic threatened to burn the countryside if Gregory didn't hand over Merovec. Gregory defiantly refused. Merovec considered his options. Staying would endanger Tours. Challenging his father head-on seemed impossible. He needed a new plan. Meanwhile, Fredegund, still suspecting Boso's loyalty, or rather his lack thereof, sent him a secret message. Get Merovec out of the church and he'd be handsomely rewarded. She knew Boso was too much given to breaking his word and could easily be bought. Boso, restless and seeking a way back into favor, accepted the bribe. He lured Merovec out under the pretense of a hunting trip. Fredegund's plan was likely for an assassin to strike then, but it failed. Still, Fredegund now knew Boso could be manipulated. Boso, however, consulted his soothsayer, who predicted Chilperic's death and Merovec's rise. Convinced by this prophecy, Boso decided to help Merovec again, in another dizzying display of his changeable loyalty. They planned to flee to Austrasia. They escaped, but were delayed, and the political situation changed dramatically. In the spring of 577, King Guntram lost his 2 teenage sons to dysentery, leaving him heirless and vulnerable. He offered to adopt Brunhild's son, Childebert, creating a powerful alliance between Burgundy and Austrasia, on one condition: the perpetual war must end. Brunhild was in a difficult position. Fredegund and Chilperic were her sworn enemies, but openly supporting Merovec, a rebel, would jeopardize her son's crucial claim to Burgundy. Merovec and Boso finally reached Austrasia but found little support. Chilperic and Guntram were pushing hard for the rebellion to end. Merovec, a man without a country, was on the run again. Chilperic, unable to catch Merovec, ravaged Tours and plundered its basilica in a fit of pique. Brunhild, unable to openly help Merovec without imperiling her son's future, hid him on Duke Lupus's land near Rams. Fredegund, meanwhile, wanted to find the source of Merovec's funding and disrupt the alliances Brunhild and her allies had painstakingly built in Neustria. Her spies reported that Bishop Praetextatus, still guarding Brunhild's treasure, was bribing nobles with Brunhild's funds. Fredegund wanted Praetextatus publicly humiliated and removed. Chilperic, eager to please her, convened a church council in Paris to try the bishop for treason, knowing they had allies among the corrupt clergy. Gregory of Tours, despite being an Austrasian ally, attended, ever the keen observer. Gregory's account of the trial is heavily biased, portraying it as a show trial driven by Fredegund's malice. Chilperic accused Praetextatus of inciting rebellion and trying to kill him. Gregory, refusing to condemn Praetextatus outright, was threatened by Chilperic, and even offered a bribe by Fredegund, which he defiantly refused. Fredegund then had other bishops pressure Praetextatus to plead guilty, promising leniency. Praetextatus confessed and was stripped of his rank, publicly beaten, and exiled. Despite the questionable means used to secure his confession, Merovec's support in Neustria crumbled. Gregory was monitored, but Merovec was still at large, a lingering threat. Then, Duke Boso, in another breathtaking act of duplicity, betrayed Merovec again. He relayed a false message, inviting Merovec to Terouanne, where Chilperic's men lay in wait. Merovec rode directly into the trap, facing certain capture and torture. He asked his loyal friend Galen to kill him before Chilperic's men arrived. Merovec was dead. Rumors spread like wildfire that Fredegund had orchestrated Merovec's death, a claim Gregory eagerly repeated, pointing to Boso and Bishop Egidius's ties to the queen. That autumn, Chilperic lost two more heirs, Merovech and Fredegund's son Samson, who died of dysentery. Only Audovera's son Clovis and Fredegund's son Clotar remained. Despite his losses, Chilperic tried to project an image of victory and stability, moving his court to Paris, holding games and hunts. Fredegund, ever resilient, gave birth to another son, Dagobert, a name meaning bright day, symbolizing their desperate hopes for the future. In Austrasia, the mood was grim, but Brunhild's influence remained strong. In 579, she arranged her eldest daughter Ingund's marriage to the Visigothic prince Hermenegild, hoping to solidify a crucial alliance with Spain and avenge Gauswintha. In the summer of 580, the Frankish lands were hit by heavy rains and a severe dysentery epidemic. Amidst this chaos, rumors circulated that Fredegund was having an affair with Bishop Bertram of Bordeaux. These rumors, attributed to Gregory by his enemy Count Ludast, were extremely dangerous, threatening the legitimacy of Fredegund's sons and thus her entire position. Fredegund couldn't let this stand. Her son's right to the throne depended entirely on their paternity being unquestioned. In September, Gregory was summoned to court on charges of treason. Gregory panicked, sought support even from Fredegund's own daughter Rigunth, who publicly fasted in his favor to annoy her mother. Gregory also asked his friend Fortunatus to write a flattering poem for the trial.
Fortunatus, living a quieter life of reading and writing at Radegund's abbey in Poitiers with Radegund and her abbess Agnes, agreed. His poem, delivered at Chilperic's villa, praised Chilperic's intellect and poetry, which Gregory privately mocked, and, significantly, praised Fredegund, calling her wise in counsel and an equal ruler sharing the cares of state. Fortunatus's calculated flattery worked. Gregory was spared, and Loidust, the accuser, was excommunicated and later brutally murdered by Fredegund's agents. But the dysentery continued its deadly sweep. Chilperic fell ill, then baby Dagobert. Fredegund, desperate, blamed the epidemic on God's punishment for her greed and Chilperic's harsh taxes. She dramatically burned the tax registers for her own cities and convinced Chilperic to burn those for the entire kingdom, forgiving all tax debts. Still, Dagobert died. Then, even more tragically, her 9-year-old son Clodobert fell ill. They prayed desperately at Saint Médard's tomb, but it was too late. Both boys were dead within 20 days of Gregory's trial. Fredegund was devastated, her powerful position now hanging by a thread, but her hold over Chilperic remained terrifyingly strong. He sent his only remaining heir, Prince Clovis, Audovera's son, to the plague-ridden villa where Dagobert had died, essentially sending him to his death to please Fredegund. Somehow, miraculously, Clovis survived. Chilperic, seeing this as a sign, welcomed him back. But Clovis, now confident and perhaps a little reckless, openly threatened his enemies, including Fredegund. Fredegund, terrified for her own safety and with no living sons of her own, became convinced that Clovis and his girlfriend, the daughter of one of her servants, were using witchcraft to kill her children. She had the girl tortured and disfigured, and her mother tortured until she confessed to witchcraft. Fredegund presented the forced confession to Chilperic, who, manipulated by her fear and his own superstition, had Clovis arrested and turned over to her. Clovis was reportedly murdered by Fredegund's agents, his body buried quickly to hide the deed. Fredegund also sent soldiers to murder Clovis's mother, Audovera, now a vulnerable widow in a convent. Audovera's daughter, Basina, the sole survivor of her family, was sent to Radegund's convent, a place of safety from Fredegund's wrath. Fredegund's servant, who had confessed under torture, later recanted, but was burned alive as a witch. Fredegund, having eliminated her stepsons, was now even more powerful, albeit with only a daughter, Regunth, and a precarious hold on the throne. Brunhild, now firmly in control in Austrasia as regent for her young son Childebert, faced challenges from disgruntled nobles who thought she should step aside. The anti-Brunhild faction was led by Dukes Ursio and Bertafred. Fredegund, hearing of this discontent, saw an opportunity and began communicating with them, likely sending bribes and promises of power. They also sought support from Duke Rausching of Soissons, a wealthy and sadistic figure known for his elaborate clothes and brutal treatment of slaves. Fredegund wanted Soissons back, and Rausching, despite his past loyalty to Brunhild, was open to offers. Together, Rausching, Ursio, and Bertafred plotted to assassinate Childebert, aiming to remove Brunhild from power and rule as regents for his young sons. They planned to ally with Fredegund and return Soissons to her. But King Guntram, despite his exasperation with Brunhild's fierce will, preferred her to a resurgent Neustria under Fredegund. He warned Childebert of the plot. The warning came just in time. Rausching was on his way to assassinate Childebert when the king and Brunhild learned of the plan. Childebert, guided by his astute mother, signed orders to seize Rausching's property. Rausching entered the king's chambers unaware and was promptly ambushed and killed, his body thrown from the window as a chilling warning. Rausching's wife fled to sanctuary. Ursio and Bertafred, unaware the plot had failed, marched on Metz but retreated when they realized the truth. They holed up in a church on Ursio's estate. Childebert, having survived one plot and with a wife and young sons to protect, needed to solidify his crucial alliance with Guntram. Guntram agreed but demanded the head of Duke Boso, who had infuriated him with his double-dealing during the Gundevald affair. Brunhild, though irritated with Boso, preferred exile to execution, seeing him as a useful if unreliable tool. But a valuable alliance was at stake. She agreed to hand him over. Boso, facing death, fled to Bishop Magnaric's lodgings, taking the old bishop hostage. Guntram, convinced Magnaric was an accomplice, ordered the building set on fire. Magnaric was rescued, but Boso, trying to fight his way out, was killed by a hail of javelins and spears, his body held upright by the weapons lodged in him. With Boso dead, the Treaty of Vandelot was finalized in November 587. This was the earliest surviving medieval treaty, and remarkably, women were included as equal parties. Brunhild, styled Most Glorious Lady, Queen Brunhild, was a peer to the kings. The treaty reaffirmed Childebert's right to inherit Burgundy and stipulated that if he died, his sons would be heirs. Nobles were forbidden from switching sides, limiting their ability to stir up rebellion. Brunhild secured her claim to Galswintha's morning gift, though Guntram would administer most of it during his lifetime. The treaty also granted significant financial independence to Brunhild, her daughters, and Guntram's daughter, protecting their property outside Salic law, a groundbreaking recognition of women's rights. The treaty brought a fragile, much-needed peace to Burgundy and Austrasia. Brunhild, having survived plots, rebellions, and assassinations, had solidified her power. She and Childebert went on a triumphant tour, showcasing their prosperity and projecting an image of unity. Fortunatus, ever the court poet, returned to court, writing poems celebrating the royal pair. Brunhild's control in Austrasia was absolute. Forgers even imitated her signature, not Childebert's. Nobles petitioned her directly. She ruled alongside her son, but she was clearly the dominant, driving figure. With domestic matters settled, Brunhild looked abroad again. Her mother, Goiswintha, back in power in Spain after King Leovigild's death, wanted a strong alliance with Austrasia. She proposed a marriage between Brunhild's youngest daughter, Clodocinda, and the new king, Recared, Regunth's former betrothed. This would revive the failed alliance between Ingund and Hermenegild. The main obstacle was the ongoing war between Guntram and Spain over Septimania. Recared converted to Catholicism, hoping to appease Guntram, and sent envoys offering peace and an alliance to both kingdoms. Guntram, still bitter over past defeats, refused, but Childebert, encouraged by Brunhild and Goiswintha, was open to negotiations. The Visigoths offered a vergeld, blood money, for Ingund's death, and though she died of plague, they took responsibility for not protecting her. Austrasia agreed to the marriage between Clodocinda and Recared, but needed Guntram's approval per the Treaty of Andelot. Guntram, still holding a grudge, was reluctant, claiming he couldn't bear to see another niece marry into the Visigothic royal family. Brunhild sent Gregory and his friend Felix to persuade Guntram. Gregory, in a moment of dry wit, confirmed to Guntram that the hatred between Brunhild and Fredegund was indeed still going strong. Reassured that the queens weren't plotting against him together, Guntram finally agreed to the marriage. Meanwhile, Rigunth, back in Rouen, was furious that her cousin Clodocinda might marry her former betrothed. She blamed Fredegund for all her misfortunes. Their arguments escalated to violence, with Fredegund reportedly slamming a chest lid on Rigunth's neck in a fit of rage. While Brunhild prepared Clodocinda's dowry, Guntram, increasingly paranoid, suspected Brunhild was actually plotting to marry one of Gundevald's sons, an unforgivable act of treachery against his own line. He blocked Austrasian envoys going to Spain and ordered a church council to try Brunhild for some unspecified moral offense, perhaps attempted incest. Brunhild, outraged, rode to Guntram's court and publicly swore an oath clearing her name, a rite usually reserved for men. The council was cancelled, and the borders reopened. Then news came that Goiswintha had been arrested in Spain after plotting against Recared. Shortly after, Goiswintha died, likely under mysterious circumstances. Recared then quickly married a Visigothic woman, ending the possibility of Clodocinda's marriage and the Spanish-Austrasian alliance. Guntram used this as another excuse for a failed campaign in Septimania. In 589, a shocking event occurred. 40 nuns, led by 2 royal princesses, Basina, Chilperic's daughter, and Clothild, Cheribert's daughter, revolted at Holy Cross Abbey, Radegund's convent. They complained of harsh treatment and illicit behavior by the new abbess, Lubovena. They walked to Tours, appealing to Gregory, then to Guntram. When their complaints weren't addressed, they returned to Poitiers, hired bodyguards whom Gregory called burglars, murderers, adulterers, and attacked the bishops sent to mediate. They then laid siege to the abbey, starving out the nuns inside. The church was alarmed by this open challenge to its authority. The ongoing plagues and famines had already shaken people's faith in the clergy's power. Wild preachers and self-proclaimed Christs were gaining followers. The nuns' revolt was another terrifying sign of instability. In the spring of 590, the rebel nuns, low on supplies, tried to kidnap the abbess, but grabbed the wrong nun by mistake. They eventually captured Lubovena, then looted the abbey, taking the highly prized True Cross relic. The Count of Poitiers attacked the rebel nuns, leading to street battles. Clothild, wielding the True Cross relic, miraculously emerged unscathed, but her men were defeated. Clothild and Basina were brought before a church tribunal. They accused the abbess of entertaining male lovers, including a cross-dressing man and a eunuch, and allowing other nuns to get pregnant. The bishops dismissed the most serious charges, but kept the princesses excommunicated. Brunhild, however, intervened, and their excommunications were lifted. Basina returned to the abbey, while Clothild retired to a country estate. The defiant nuns had challenged the church's authority and, to some extent, gotten away with it. Brunhild, after the collapse of the Spanish marriage plans, quickly arranged a marriage for Clodocinda with a Bavarian duke, securing a pragmatic alliance on her eastern border. This was less prestigious than Spain, but vitally important. Meanwhile, Guntram continued his failed campaigns against the Bretons in the west. Fredegund, ever the opportunist, allied herself with the Breton king, Warroch, sending disguised Saxon troops to help him, unbeknownst to Guntram. Guntram failed to subdue the Bretons, suffering heavy losses. His mood darkened, and he became increasingly paranoid, even killing his chamberlain over a suspected hunting violation. Then, unexpectedly, the Burgundian prisoners held by the Bretons were released. Guntram saw it as a miracle, but it was actually Fredegund who had begged Warroch to release them, after her son, Clothar, fell gravely ill with dysentery. Clothar was near death. Last rites were given, and Guntram was informed he had died. Guntram set out for the funeral, but turned back when news came that Clothar's fever had miraculously broken. Clothar's near-death experience shook Fredegund to her core. She vowed to never be so vulnerable again. If anything happened to Clothar, she would make sure Brunhild did not triumph. In the autumn of 590, she planned her boldest assassination attempt yet, targeting both Childebert and his eldest son, Theudebert. Fredegund was credibly linked to 12 assassination attempts, 6 of which were successful. She preferred using slaves or lower-class individuals who were easier to control and whose actions could be disavowed by the crown. She reportedly used wine, sometimes laced with a special potion, to steal their nerves, playing on their desperation for reward or their fear of her power and growing reputation for witchcraft. Her latest plot involved 12 assassins, 6 for Childebert, 6 for his son Theudebert. One assassin, sent to kill Childebert as he prayed, became paralyzed by fear when caught. He confessed the entire plan. Childebert ordered a search for the others. Many died under interrogation or committed suicide. The survivors were brutally maimed, hands, ears, or noses cut off, becoming objects of ridicule, not heroes. Spooked by the plot, Brunhild purged her court of disloyal nobles, even trying Bishop Egidius for treason based on a tortured confession. Egidius, who had opposed Brunhild for years, confessed and was exiled, though his fellow bishops questioned the verdict and his purported crimes. Brunhild replaced him with Duke Lupus's son, Romulf, solidifying her control over the church in the region. With internal opposition largely crushed, Brunhild focused on expanding her influence abroad. She continued sending armies to harry the Lombards in Italy, hoping to recover her grandson, Athanagild, from Byzantine captivity. However, these campaigns were largely unsuccessful. After 590, the Lombards simply paid the Austrasians to stay away, providing a steady income that Brunhild shrewdly used for public works and bolstering her power base. Around this time, Athanagild likely died in captivity. With the Neustrian threat hobbled, Brunhild embarked on an ambitious building spree in Autun, aiming to restore it to Roman grandeur. She also reformed the tax system, which was unpopular with the wealthy, but helped the poor. In 601, Theudebert II came of age and took control of Austrasia. Brunhild moved permanently to Burgundy to oversee her younger grandson, Theuderic II's kingdom, and her ambitious projects in Autun. Later stories claimed Theudebert had kicked her out, but this was likely propaganda crafted by her enemies. Brunhild maintained significant influence over Theuderic, who was more interested in women than governance. Theuderic had several sons with concubines, which Brunhild cleverly encouraged, as it allowed her to remain the de facto queen and regent as long as he didn't marry a legitimate queen. Brunhild even sabotaged a marriage alliance for Theuderic with a Spanish princess, likely to avoid being replaced by a younger rival queen. Pope Gregory the Great,
while praising Brunhild's piety and support for missions, also pushed her to crack down on simony, buying church offices, and address rumors of scandalous behavior by priests, possibly sexual offenses. In 603, Brunhild convened a church council, not to address simony directly, but to try Bishop Desiderius of Vienne for rape. In a shocking verdict, he was found guilty and exiled, though Justa, his accuser, later recanted under pressure and died, and later accounts of the trial were rewritten to erase the rape charge. It's possible Brunhild was genuinely responding to the Pope's concerns about clerical misconduct, using the opportunity to remove a political opponent. Desiderius, once reinstated, became a vocal critic of Brunhild and Theodoric and was later murdered, possibly at their behest. Brunhild also clashed with the Irish monk Columbanus, a strict ascetic who criticized Theodoric's morals and famously refused to bless his illegitimate sons. Columbanus's followers joined his opposition to Brunhild. Eventually, Brunhild had him exiled, but he continued to agitate against her. Brunhild also faced a tax rebellion in the Jura region, where locals resented paying taxes to a distant queen and agitated for independence, creating a nationalist movement. Brunhild established a royal palace in the region and installed her granddaughter, Thordelinda, there to monitor the situation, also appointing a handsome but unpopular favorite, Protadius, as governor. Family tensions flared in 605 when Clothar II attacked Burgundy. Theudebert was supposed to help Theuderic, but his forces arrived late and then retreated, leaving Theuderic to fight alone. Theuderic won, but his mayor of the palace was killed. Brunhild appointed Protadius to the powerful position, a move deeply unpopular with the aristocracy. The army mutinied and murdered Protadius. Brunhild retaliated fiercely against those who orchestrated his death. Brunhild considered retirement, but remained actively engaged as battles continued between Theuderic and Theudebert, with Clothar stirring the pot from Neustria. Brunhild even attempted to broker peace between her grandsons, reaching out to Theudebert's wife, Bilichild. But Bilichild was murdered by Theudebert, likely under the influence of nobles who opposed any peace settlement. The brothers' feud culminated in a horrific battle in 612, where Theuderic decisively defeated Theudebert, capturing him and his treasury. Theudebert's baby son was brutally murdered. Theudebert himself was tonsured and exiled, effectively ending his line. Theuderic reunited Austrasia and Burgundy. Brunhild, now sole queen, was at the absolute height of her power, having outmaneuvered every foe. A few months later, Theuderic, only 26 and seemingly in prime health, suddenly died while on a military march, likely from contaminated water or dysentery. His death was sudden, unexpected, and left the kingdoms in chaos. He left behind 4 young sons. Brunhild, now approaching 70, a woman of extraordinary resilience and ambition, aimed to unite the kingdoms under the eldest, Sigebert II, appointing herself regent once again. She broke with traditional Frankish practice by favoring one son for the entire inheritance, echoing the old Roman model of a single emperor. However, disgruntled nobles in Austrasia and Burgundy, wary of an aging queen ruling through a child and seeing a king in his 20s, Clothar II, next door, invited Clothar to take over. Brunhild sent Sigebert east with the mayor of the palace, Warnachar, and Burgundian nobles, either for protection or to recruit troops. One account claimed Brunhild sent orders for Warnachar's death, but he somehow learned of it and conspired with Clothar and his powerful allies, Bishop Arnulf and Duke Pippin. Sigebert II, barely a teenager, was sent to face Clothar's army with his younger brothers. Warnachar and his men deserted, leaving the boys hopelessly outnumbered. Sigebert, Corbus, and Merovec were captured. 10-year-old Childebert, however, managed to escape on a horse,
disappearing into the chaos. Brunhild and her granddaughter Theudelinda were captured at their palace in Orbe. They were transported in rough, jouncing carts to Clotar's camp at Genève. Clotar, now 26 and in control of a vast army thanks to the betrayal of Brunhild's own nobles, ordered the immediate execution of Sigebert and Corbus, eliminating any direct male heirs. The youngest, Merovec, was spared and sent to Neustria, possibly because Clotar was his godfather. Theudelinda was also spared and sent to a convent. Clotar, needing to consolidate his power and eliminate any potential threats to his newly expanded kingdom, had to decide Brunhild's ultimate fate. Her continued existence, especially with young Childebert's escape, posed a significant risk. Clotar's allies, those nobles who had betrayed Brunhild, clamored for her death, eager to remove the formidable queen who had so often thwarted them. Brunhild was brought before a makeshift tribunal. Clotar, likely manipulated by these eager nobles seeking to eliminate Brunhild's influence and clear their own names, accused her of the deaths of 10 kings, a staggering and largely fabricated list that included her husband Sigebert, Merovec, Clovis, her grandson Theudebert, and even 2 of the great-grandsons he himself had just brutally executed. He also cynically blamed her for his father Chilperic's death, and even the death of his infant son Dagobert, who had died of illness years earlier. Despite the flimsy accusations and the transparent political maneuvering, the assembled nobles and soldiers, whipped into a frenzy, cried for her to be found guilty. Brunhild was legally deposed, her royal regalia stripped away, a final public humiliation. She expected exile or the relative mercy of the convent, but Clotar, eager to make an example and cement his own power, sentenced her to death. Brunhild was tortured for 3 horrific days, enduring unimaginable suffering. Then, in a final, brutal humiliation, designed to erase her legacy and make her a terrifying example, she was tied to a wild horse, or some accounts say several wild horses, and dragged across the rocky, unforgiving terrain, her body ripped to shreds. Clotar then ordered her remains burned, preventing her tomb from becoming a shrine for any future opposition. The execution of Brunhild, orchestrated by Clotar and his newfound allies, Warnachar, Arnulf, and Pippin, was a turning point. It reunited the Frankish kingdoms under one ruler for the first time in over 50 years, bringing an end to the brutal civil wars. But in doing so, Clotar empowered the very nobles who had betrayed Brunhild. These powerful men, who would later become the ancestors of Charlemagne, secured their own power by limiting the king's authority, gradually laying the groundwork for the decline of the Merovingian monarchy. Clotar, perhaps recognizing their treachery, later disposed of many of them. But the office of mayor of the palace, held by Warnachar, became a lifetime appointment, then hereditary, eventually overshadowing the Merovingian kings, who became known derisively as the Do-Nothing Kings. The history of this tumultuous era was rewritten by Clotar, and later by the Carolingians, to demonize Brunhild and Fredegund, casting them as wicked, power-hungry women solely responsible for all the civil wars and chaos. Fredegund's complexities were reduced to that of a cunning adulteress and murderous slave. Brunhild became a murderous Jezebel, a cruel witch. Their accomplishments were erased, their considerable political skills ignored, and their stories twisted into cautionary tales about women who dared to wield power in a man's world. And so, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the dark queens, Brunhild and Fredegund. Remember their struggles, their sacrifices, and their triumphs, however fleeting. Remember that history is often written by the victors, and sometimes the most fascinating, complex stories are the ones they tried desperately to erase. Think of the crumbling Roman ruins, the smoky huts, the constant threat of disease and violence.
Think of the burning ambition that drove two women to navigate this brutal, unforgiving world and rise to power against all odds. And remember that even in the darkest of ages, women found ways to fight, to scheme, to survive, and to leave their indelible mark, whether in gilded mosaics or whispered legends. They were not just wives or mothers. They were queens in a time and place that had no clear place for them, who carved out their own destinies with blood, gold, and an iron will. The stories they tried to bury are still here, waiting to be uncovered. These aren't merely footnotes or forgotten names etched into crumbling stone. They are vibrant narratives, pulsating with the echoes of their audacious lives. The very act of their burial was a testament to their power, a deliberate erasure orchestrated by those threatened by their influence, by the inconvenient truths they embodied, or simply by a patriarchal world determined to define women solely within domestic confines. Yet, history, like the shifting sands of an ancient desert, rarely keeps its secrets forever. To unearth these tales is to engage in a profound excavation, not just of physical ruins, but of cultural biases and interpretive silences. We delve into palimpsests of papyrus, decode cryptic carvings, and listen to the faint whispers carried on the wind through desolate palace corridors. Each shard of pottery, every glint of forgotten jewelry, or the subtle deviation in a chronicle penned by a male scribe, offers a tantalizing clue. These fragments speak of more than mere political machinations. They reveal the intricate tapestries of their hearts, their loves, their losses, their strategic alliances veiled in charm, their ruthless decisions made from positions of impossible vulnerability. The women who emerge from this reevaluation are complex, multifaceted figures. Warrior queens who led armies, sorceresses who wielded influence through mysticism, cunning regents who navigated treacherous courts, and visionaries who reshaped empires from behind silken curtains. Their resilience, their ambition, and their often brutal pragmatism were not aberrations, but vital tools for survival and dominance in an unforgiving world. In bringing these suppressed voices back into the light, we do more than correct historical inaccuracies. We reclaim a richer, more nuanced understanding of humanity's past, challenging our present-day assumptions about power, leadership, and the enduring strength of the female spirit. These are not just stories to be told. They are legacies to be honored, lessons to be learned, an inspiration for those who still seek to carve their own indelible mark upon the world.